Did you already press record?
Good to go.
All right, so my name is Juke, and it is great to be with you all. And what Michael was saying about Brett is probably true for me as well. Brett has taught me how to do our blog. We have a website called welcometotruth.com. And we have a lot of blogs on there. Welcome to truth.com is an apologetics website. So we try to find fun ways to teach these very difficult topics. So we have videos, we have rap songs, we have blogs, and a board game, a card game. And so, yeah, Brett has been instrumental in helping with to teach me how to write proper blogs, so that's been great. And
His blogs, by the way, guys, I know this isn't apologetics. They have like an average of 18-minute time on page, which is insane.
yeah, so they're long form blogs, and again, that's just something that Brett got on and then kind of taught me how to do. And so topics covering like archaeology of the New Testament, archaeology of the Old Testament that supports the Bible, who is Jesus, how do we know Jesus lived, the reliability of the New Testament. And so yeah, it's exciting. Well, and welcome to Truth. We just try again to find fun ways to teach that information.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I think what you've told me in the past is your goal is to try to get the reasons why the Christian faith is so reliable to younger people, to kids, and make it easy to learn, even though they're high level concepts. So I know I've used the card game and the board game with youth groups and my kids and everything. So uh,
Yeah, I've talked to you about this, but the statistic of 75%
mm,
of young people who go to college. So these are Christians who grow up in the church. 75% of them lose their faith before their college days are over. So they grow up in the church and then they go to college, and 75%, so 3 out of 4 lose their faith. So that means 3 out of 4 of every youth ministry you see, according to these statistics, is having trouble. And I believe that that is because they go to a place and they don't know how to handle themselves through something like apologetics.
yeah, which is more of an intellectual thing. So Juke, let's do this as we get started. And I also want to open this up. If you guys have a question or a thought, you're welcome to pop in. That's one of the cool parts of the live call. But with that, Juke, I want to open it up and just ask you to begin, what is apologetics?
Right. So apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, which can be found in 1 Peter 3:15, when it says, always be ready to give a defense for I forget what it is,
The hope that lies
hope that
within
you
you.
have. Yeah, yeah. And that word defense is the word apologia. And so apologetics are uh, is is a curriculum. It's basically studying the evidence, the reasons that Christianity is true. And so that can be we kind of base it, in our board game, we have 4 categories. One is Christianity, which goes over things about Jesus and things about early Christianity. Then there's science, which is a huge one, evolution, um, the belief that, in that science disproves God or something is on the is is on the outside. It seems like, okay, yeah, I could see that, but once you start to delve deeper into it, nothing could be further from the truth. The third category we have in our board game is called philosophy, and so that's dealing with moral relativism and other philosophical ideas. And then the fourth one is, I say philosophy, but it's actually
Reason.
reason. And then the fourth one is religion, just studying the different religions and why Christianity is true. And just tell me, you let me know, Brett, if you want me to go into any more detail or just short answers. By the
Yeah.
way, By the way, TZ, good to see you, man. I look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks in Hawaii.
Look forward to seeing you soon too, man. We'll hit the hot tub up some evenings.
And the
Awesome.
scooter. I'm going to be trying to bring my
He's
scooter
bringing
out.
his scooter.
How are
Yeah.
you gonna? You can't. There's no way. You can't fly with used lithium-ion batteries.
Well, they said if you remove the battery
Oh my
and have it
gosh.
in a separate
This is a
compartment.
serious conversation.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Let's
Anyways,
let's focus.
oh,
We can talk about the scooters later.
yes, yes. Hopefully we'll
Okay,
see.
bringing it
Okay.
back. Okay, so let me ask you this, Juke. Um, and I think this is something that I have seen that's an issue with a lot of believers, but why do we need to know all of these categories and like science and evolution or other religions, Buddhism or New Age, like all this stuff? Why do we need to know all that stuff when that stuff's outside the Bible? Why can't we just tell them the gospel message and it's the Bible, it's the word of God? What's the problem? What's the problem with that?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think the problem is that we live in a post-Christian America, or I would say society, and that's whether you're in America or other countries as well. So so a lot of people, like my parents, they grew up in the 50s. And so when they grew up, it was like these things were obvious. Like you didn't have to question whether the Bible was authentic. You didn't have to question some of these different topics. It was only a small percentage of people that would say question those things. But today, all of those things are questioned. Are the very fabric of our society of our beliefs are questioned. Why believe anything? What is a man? What is a woman? These sort of questions that in the past were so seemingly obvious. Today, everything seems to be questioned. And so, this is a great question that Brett said, because this is something that I run into a lot when I talk about apologetics with other Christians. There, a lot of the parents, like people from my mom and dad's generation, will say, um, or even a little younger, but definitely from their generation, they'll say, hey, look, we have, I believe by faith, I believe by faith, and we don't need all of this extra intellectual thing and intellectual stuff. And that's good for them. But guess what? Their kids and their grandkids are coming into a war zone when they go to their school
Yeah.
with these exact challenges, and their professors have some of their professors see it as their goal to take this idea of God, this, as they see it, fictitious fairy tale idea of God, and just do away with it in that child's mind. They want to take 18 years of of church going tos and just knock it out in like one semester by
Yeah.
just being like, you're stupid.
Yeah.
Evolution disproves God.
Yeah.
So
And
yes,
if I can, Zach, you and I were having a conversation. You just read Richard Dawking, who is a leading popularizer of atheism and is he a zoologist? Is that right? Richard
He's an
Dawkins,
evolutionary zoologist.
evolutionary zoologist. And what did you tell me that he was actively trying to do in his book, The God Delusion?
Yeah, so in the God Delusion, which is his kind of fully formatted case for why it's not just false to have the belief, but it's actually somewhat silly to hold the belief. And one of the things that he talks about is how much of a crime he views it to be to raise children in the faith, and that presumably children should be raised, I guess, neutral. But he also talks specifically about the need to evangelize essentially
From
and
an
bring
atheist,
more people into the atheistic belief system,
which is
that
such an
would
interesting
be
belief.
that would make the world a better place. From his perspective, it would make the world a better place if more people were converted to
Yeah.
atheism, essentially.
mm,
And so that you guys know, who are maybe a little newer to this, and anybody watching, the reason why that's so interesting is because what's the purpose in evangelizing if there's no God to tell us to do it? The atheist believes that when they die, they cease to exist. Nothing happens. It's not black. You'd have to perceive blackness, right? It's just you cease to exist. There's nothing there, and the universe will slowly burn out, and then it's all for nothing, and we're just pure chance. What does it matter if you bring people to atheism or not? It's kind of a funny perspective, kind of interesting. But okay, so before we switch over and actually move into atheism, Juke, I have one more question, and I find that this is something that's useful to know. Apologetics isn't necessarily for every single conversation. You know, you're not going to get into some kind of intellectual discussion. I avoid debates personally. I just use the information when it comes up naturally and comfortably. But when is it useful? Because there are obviously emotional conversations, conversations with grief, conversations where maybe people need prayer, conversations where, you know, we just need to pray for a miracle, or conversations that need some kind of academic approach. How do you discern when to use more of an apologetic approach and when to take some other kind of approach, and maybe what kind of approaches are there other than the apologetics?
Okay. So let me just first of all, you were talking about Richard Dawkins, and I just wanted to say that Richard Dawkins um, is part of what's called the New Atheism, or also called the Four Horsemen. And I just looked it up real quick. I want to make sure I got the names right. So the Four Horsemen of Atheism are Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and the late great Christopher Hitchens.
Yeah.
And so
He passed away.
Christopher Hitchens.
he did, yes, yes.
Oh.
So these guys came out right after like 2001. So September 11th happened, and um, there was a lot of whatever. Some people there was a lot of questions regarding religions and Islam and different things. And these guys started to come out with these books, very popular, probably in 2003, 2004, etc., and started to sell a lot of books. And so, just so you know, anyway, that's where those guys started to pop off at, and kind of slamming, as TZ as Zach was saying, just slamming religion as just a terrible thing to do to your child, that it was child abuse to believe in religion and these sort of things. So anyway, those are called the Four Horsemen. Okay, you were saying, when is apologetics useful? I would say first and foremost, it is useful to the believer. And this is kind of our target market with Welcome to Truth. Look, we want to talk to atheists and convince them, but our target market is just to encourage Christians. If you look at Christians in America, or even in the world, no, probably 95%, maybe higher, do not know what apologetics is. They don't know that there's any proof. Brett and I were lucky enough to go to a church where we had our own resident apologist, basically, that kind of fueled the fire for both of us in apologetics. But most churches, the vast majority, as you guys are all aware probably, do not have an apologetics person. So we feel at Welcome to Truth, if we can get the church, if we can get even 10% of the church to be aware of these truths, it will encourage them. It will build their faith. I was 33 years old. I'm 40 now and balding nicely. I was 33 years old when I first started to learn about the incredible evidence. And I'm like, why am I 33 and just hearing about this for the first time? If I knew that this evidence was out there when I went to high school, if I knew when I was in college that this evidence was out there, I would have been in a way better position. I wouldn't have gone off and did the stupid things that I did back then, because I would have had a strong, firm foundation. So I would say, first of all, it's to build up the believer. And secondly, it's to answer questions that believers come into contact with at their schools.
Right.
And then thirdly, I would say maybe to convert actual
Right.
atheists or people who hate God.
And if I can juke so for everybody else in the room, it's like, hey, well, if I'd known about the evidence, maybe I'll just give one example of evidence he's referring to, which is, did you know that there is a very high amount of evidence for the life of Christ. I mean, he's a provable historical figure, and it's not even questioned among atheists. You wouldn't have known that, or that the evidence to support the validity of the New Testament, especially, and also the Old Testament, is greater than any other ancient work. So you want to talk about Shakespeare, you want to talk about Aristotle, you want to talk about all these people. The Bible has tens of thousands of documents to affirm, where Shakespeare has like a half a dozen, something like that. And we teach Shakespeare in school, but then the culture comes around and say, well, we really can't trust the Bible. It's absurd when you actually understand how historians view ancient works, and then there's a double standard that's just absolutely ridiculous. It's laughable once you start learning it. So that's awesome. Thank you, Jonathan. Juke, in my head, I was like, I'm going to be formal and call him Jonathan, and we're not going to do that. Okay, so is there anything else you want to share on any of that, Juke, or does anybody else have any questions before we move into kind of the first subject that we're going to be looking at together?
Ah, I have a question, and I've also asked you this before, Brett. I just want to hear Jonathan's perspective. So, Jonathan, I've been consuming some philosophical materials the last 6 months, Stoicism, Epicureanism, and all this. And there's also a book Brett sent, referred to me, something to do with Christian philosophy. Can't remember the title correctly.
I know. Here.
Yeah.
Philosophical Foundations of a Christian Worldview by Moreland and Craig.
Yeah,
That's
so
what I recommended. The brick.
Of course,
yeah.
Of course, Brett has that book. Of
I
course.
love this book.
Yeah. So my question is, how do you combine this worldly knowledge with the Bible? Because at some point, when you're, let's say, going through Stoicism, you feel like they are diverging. Christianity is taking the right direction, and Stoicism is taking the left. You have people talking about Greek gods. Yeah, this what I'm looking for. I don't know why today a lot of ideas are sleeping in my mind. A sage, a sage. Yeah, you see now in this philosophy, people like Marcus Aurelius are the sage we should emulate. But at no point, do you never hear about Jesus being also the sage at some point, because Christianity on its own is also philosophy, right? I don't know. How do you combine all these together, or do you just leave the other one and just stick with Christianity
It's like it's a
teaching?
question on critical thinking. How do you pull the truth out of secular ideas where there might be a nugget of truth, but also a lot of falsehood? Is that the question?
Yes. Yes.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I think within that question, first of all, what comes to mind is all knowledge. I mean, it's not like there's Christianity and then there's like everything else. Like Christianity pulls from the knowledge of God. God gave us wisdom. Like scientists, listen, early scientists, the people who came up with the scientific method in the 17th century, okay, 16th century, Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, Galileo, Copernicus, these people were all believers. And the way that they looked at science back then was as a way to explain what God did. Like, God created all this. Hey, it'll be really exciting to see how he did it. Like, it's a discovery process. Like gravity has always been around. Electricity has always been around, but we just started harnessing or understanding those things, but they were always there from the beginning. And so I would say, first of all, there is no separation between, okay, this is Christian knowledge and this is like, world. It's all going to point to God. The more you study science, back in when Charles Darwin wrote Origin of Species in 1859, they thought that the cell was a globular cluster just like some jelly, like some chemical jelly. Now we look into the cell and we can see it's one of the most intricate cities. It's like a city of intricate things happening. So it's actually old. Some people like to look at Christianity like that's old school, but actually the belief in Darwinian evolution that they teach in schools today is an outdated model. That is actually the outdated model. And the more that you study science, the more you see the amazingness of God's fingerprint all over it. So I would say, first of all, it's all going to point to God. The deeper you look, maybe on the surface level it doesn't look that way, but the deeper you look in philosophy, in each of the science, biology, physics, physics. Well, we'll get into science later, but anyways, all those things point to God. The complexity of the cell, all of those things point to God. And then what was the other thing you were saying? And then the other thing is to separate between legend and Christian. People try and group Christianity in. Of course, they're going to group it in with other religions, but Christianity is based on a historic event. It is not based on in Islam, like in Islam, Muhammad goes into the cave of Hira, and he's in there and he has this religious experience by himself. And then he comes out of this cave and he tells people about it, and people write it down, and then they believe what he said. But Christianity is the only religion that is based on a supernatural historical event. Either Jesus rose from the dead or he didn't. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, Christianity is false. And as Paul says, we are all to be pitied more than any other person. So if Jesus did not rise from the dead, so it's not based on something that we want to believe or we want to make true. It's based on a historical event. Either Jesus rose from the dead or he didn't. If he did rise from the dead, then that backs up everything he was saying, where he predicted he was going to rise from the dead, and his prophecies and all of those things. It backs that up, and he was the Son of God. If he didn't rise from the dead, then it's wrong, and we're all still stuck in our sin and all of that. So Christianity is different in that it's based on an actual historical event that can be debated, argued, researched. It actually happened in history.
And thank you, Juke. And if I can just add to support your point, firstly, on the first part that you had mentioned, which there's not like Christianity and then everything else. What there is there's two types of revelation. There's divine revelation, which is what we find in Scripture, which there is a tremendous amount of evidence to support. I've been watching biblical archaeology. It just blows my mind how accurate this stuff is from a text written 3,500 years ago. Like it's nuts. I'll give you guys a channel. Anyway, but there's divine revelation, and then there's natural revelation, which is just the world that God created. And God created science. God created, logic and reason, like math. We didn't invent math. We discover math. It is something that God put in the system. And if God made the system and God wrote the Bible, then if you study the system and the Bible is true and God made that, then the system is going to support the reasons in the Bible. And Juke, to support your point on these scientists, what atheists will say is, well, of course, all the original scientists were Christian. Everybody was a Christian. Well, that's not true, because science could have arisen in the way it did in the West in any culture. The problem with those cultures is they didn't believe in a God that was reasonable and consistent. So they didn't have a reason to go looking for science. And so what you find, for example, in Psalms 8, it talks about the paths of the sea. And forgive me, I don't remember what guy this is, but he went in the late 1800s and said, I am going to find the paths of the sea. He was a retired Marine. And he said, I am going to find the paths of the sea and prove that the Scripture is true as science in this regard. And he went and he founded oceanography. And so we have the entire field of oceanography that's true with atmospherics. And another example of believers engaging in the study of the natural world or natural revelation is Johannes Kepler, who was a Lutheran and devout Christian. He discovered the planetary laws of motion, and there's a quote attributed to him, which is something to the effect, I'm not quoting it exactly, but when you discover the laws of the universe, it is getting to think God's thoughts after him, because God made it. So he gets to discover and be more intimate with the creator afterwards. And so to that end, that's one part to the question. And then the other part to the question, Michael, I think is, how do you pull it out? Well, I think you were talking about the sage in regard to Stoicism. If I'm understanding correctly, that has to do with like the ideal person. Is that correct?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, yes.
Okay. So you see this throughout philosophy, and this is a grounding issue. Grounding being like, for example, if I'm an atheist, and this is literally a grounding issue that atheists do not know how to solve. And that being, okay, should you murder people? And the atheist says, absolutely not. And then you ask them why, and the reasons are really flimsy. Well, if you ask a Christian, why shouldn't you murder people? Because God abhors evil and murder is evil. So don't murder people. And you have an objective, not objective, an absolute moral reason to not murder. Well, with atheism, there is no God. There is no purpose. There is no bigger reason. So it's just, well, because it's bad. Well, why? Well, there's a lot of reasons, contractarianism, there's like a number of different things they try to do, but it doesn't make sense. There's no actual grounds for the morality. And this is called the moral argument against atheism. So there's no reason to believe it. Well, when you look at philosophers, this, like you said, the sage in, I'm not familiar with that one actually, but the sage in, oh my gosh, with Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism, you've got the philosopher king from, I believe, Plato or Socrates. I'm not getting that exact. A really famous one is the Supermacht, I think is what it's called. Ubermensch, Ubermach, whatever. That's from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, whatever. I'm not even going to try. From Nietzsche. And what they do is these philosophers try to find what the ideal person would be, and then they base their philosophy off of these ideal people. Well, Christianity has an ideal person, and he's God, and we have his character in the Bible. And so I think one of the ways that you can ground, because what are they doing? They're grounding their reasoning in this ideal person, which they just made up. Well, we have an ideal person that we didn't make up. And not only that, we have a ton of evidence to suggest he was really, really a real person, and he lived and he died and he rose from the dead and he went and ascended into heaven at the right hand of the Father because he's God. And we can base all of our philosophy off of the real ideal. And so we can compare the Supermacht or the sage or the philosopher king, whatever it is that the philosophers are using, and say, how does that compare to Jesus? And then you can reason from there, and you can compare and contrast what they say the ideal is with what you believe the actual ideal is. Does that help the second question?
Yes, yes.
God bless you.
Yes. Okay, cool. Any other thoughts or questions before we move on? Good. Josh, good. Cool.
Good.
Okay, so what we'll do at this point,